Welcome everyone. This is ACSM's May Brown Bag in Science. We are very pleased to have you all with us today. We are coming to you from the National Office in Indianapolis, and you may know May is racing month here in Indy. So we are really excited to have Dr. Ed Potkanowicz with us today to share his research about motorsports. So I'm going to give a brief introduction of Ed, and then we'll turn the presentation over to him. If you have questions, we'll have time for questions at the end, so go ahead and type your questions into the question area in the GoToWebinar screen. And finally, if you have trouble with seeing the presentation or hearing the presentation, go ahead and log out and log back in. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Potkanowicz. He's an associate professor of exercise physiology at Ohio Northern University in Ada, Ohio. He's also the principal investigator of the ongoing racing research project entitled the R.A.C.E.R project, which is an acronym for the Real Assessment of Core and Environmental Responses. He received his doctorate and master's degree in exercise physiology from Kent State University and his Bachelor of Science degree in exercise science from Youngstown State University. His work examines the body's thermoregulatory response to environmental stressors during sport performance. More specifically, he's working to develop a biometric sensor for the assessment of the physiological stressors experienced by the driver-athlete during competition. As a lifelong racing enthusiast, he has a keen interest in uncovering and/or developing strategies for improving driver performance as it relates to managing core body temperature and the driver's physiological response to the microenvironment of the cockpit. Today, his webinar presentation entitled The Wired Driver, a discussion of biometric sensing in motorsport, will examine the topic of biometric sensing within the motorsports community and the work being done in the area of driver monitoring. Ed is going to give his presentation, and then when we have Q&A at the end, he's going to join us on camera so you can put a face with a name. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And at this time, we're going to ask Ed to unmute himself, and we'll turn it over to him for his presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Kraft, for the very nice introduction. And good afternoon and welcome to everyone who's joined today's webinar. Before we get started, I wanted to be sure to thank the American College of Sports Medicine, and more specifically, Dr. Kraft, for the invitation to present today's Brown Bag in Science webinar. I also wanted to be sure to thank Ms. Anitra Butler for all of her help leading up to today's webinar. And lastly, I wanted to thank each one of you who has decided to join us today for your interest in the topics of motorsports and driver science. To give you some idea of where we're going to go today, I thought that I'd give you a little bit of background about myself and then move on to talk about the work that I do. And then lastly, finish up by talking about where I see this kind of work going in the future. And to be completely honest here at the beginning, we're only going to scratch the surface today on what I think is a very interesting topic. In fact, I think that we could talk about this for the entirety of an academic year. And so really what we're going to do is just sort of introduce the topic today and, as I said, really sort of scratch the surface. As Dr. Kraft said, I'm currently an associate professor in the exercise physiology program at Ohio Northern University. I did my undergraduate work at Youngstown State University, go Penguins, and I did both my master's and PhD at Kent State University. My research focus while I was at Kent State University was in both environmental physiology and the physiology of aging, and I have on occasion been fortunate enough to combine these two topics in some of my own research. While I was at Kent State University, I spent the majority of my time working in the environmental physiology lab, where we did some really interesting work. For example, I was involved in projects that examined the influence of race and ethnicity on thermoregulation. There were projects that examined the impact of the aging process on thermoregulation. We conducted protracted cold water immersion studies, and we even examined the impact of prolonged heat exposure on human performance. Now, what I think is perhaps most important to know about me is that I am and have always been a fan of motorsports. I have always watched with absolute awe as driver athletes navigate the courses and the tracks that they race on, and have always marveled at how they manage to control all that they have to do, all while traveling at times at over 200 miles per hour. And so when I would be in the library walking amongst the stacks, looking for material for the research that was going on in our lab, or looking for journal articles for my own graduate work, I would take a break every now and again and I would look for articles about race car drivers. What I quickly came to realize that very, very few people had ever taken the time to look at this kind of athlete. Nobody had really taken the time to investigate the race car driver. In fact, to this day, there are far fewer than 100 peer-reviewed manuscripts addressing the topic of the driver athlete. And so as I paged through the few articles that I could find, it became really clear to me that drivers were being left to their own devices to figure out how to prepare for, and more importantly, how to tolerate the rigors of the cockpit. Now, I think the reason for this is because the spectator doesn't see an obvious physical effort in motorsport as they do, say, in traditional sports. And as a result of that, they're not really ever considered to be athletes. And I don't know that this could be anything further from the truth. And the work that's being done currently is making great progress to dispel this idea that race car drivers aren't athletes. But when you compare it to traditional sports, for example, when you watch American football, you see the hit. When you watch baseball, you see that diving catch or you see that slide into home. In motorsports, all the spectator sees is the car moving around the track. And even with in-car cameras, the spectator never really sees all that the driver athlete is doing during the course of the race. And this really couldn't be further from the truth, because the driver is managing not only the traffic, but the driver is listening to information coming to his earpiece from the pit. He or she is reading data coming across the dashboard. So what they're doing in the car isn't really accurately represented, even when we see something like an in-car camera. And I think that's is a really good lead in to what I kind of refer to as the uniqueness of the race car driver. Think about it. What sport involves high speed, long duration? There are really no timeouts in motorsports. Yes, you can argue that they come into the pit, but even in the pit, they have a lot to do while they're there for those few short seconds. The driver is subjected to significant thermal stress, not only from the external environment, but also from the internal environment. As an example, consider that the race car driver wears a fire suit that is often 5 layers thick. Underneath that fire suit, he or she is wearing fireproof underwear that covers the driver from neck to toe. And then on top of that, they put what's called a head sock to cover their head, and then they put a helmet on top of that. And we all know that thermoregulation really relies in great part on exposure to the environment. And so when you put the race car driver in his suit, and then you put him or her into the cockpit, you have a number of microenvironments that work against the driver and put him or her under significant thermal stress. In fact, if you look at a race car driver, really, during the course of a race event, the only thing being exposed to the environment is what you see in the visor of the helmet. And in most cases, that's down during competition. So when you think about motorsport, what sport involves high speed, long duration, significant thermal stress, repetitive G loading? And again, as an example, with this being the month of May and with everyone getting ready for the Indy 500, during the course of the Indy 500, a race car driver will go through 800 G loading cycles in the course of the race. Now, compare that, say, to an astronaut who undergoes one significant G loading when they leave the surface of the Earth. A race car driver is subjected to 800 G loading cycles when they're competing in the Indianapolis 500. And so when you think about the uniqueness of the race car driver, what sport has repetitive G loading? What sport has combined physiological stresses? What sport has significant and prolonged muscular effort, amongst other things? And on top of all of that, the risk of severe injury or even immediate death. And so as a fan of motorsport, when I would see these fantastic crashes and as I watched these great feats of driving, I'd wonder, well, what led to that crash? Or how did the driver just do that? Was it perhaps muscular fatigue that contributed to the crash? Was it poor decision making because he or she was hyperthermic, or even what kind of training was the driver using to be so on his or her game at that late stage in the race. As a, let's just say, burgeoning researcher, I wanted to know what made them so good, how they physically managed these cars, and how they survived these horrific crashes. And so that's really what I set out to do in my own work. I set out to quantify that which had yet to be measured. There was very little in the literature. It didn't seem as though anyone was looking at this particular athlete. And so I set out to quantify the actual physical responses of the driver athlete to the environment of the cockpit during competition. The term that I and a colleague of mine, Dr. Ron Mendel from the University of Mount Union, came up with to describe what was being studied was driver science. And in our article from 2013, we defined driver science as the objective and scientific examination of the driver's physiological response to the environment of the cockpit, from which data-based recommendations can be made to improve driver safety, driver tolerance, and driver performance. And the important part of this definition is data-based. There really isn't a sport or an athlete that doesn't use data to improve their performance. There isn't a sport that just goes into training or preparation blindly or relying on anecdotal data. But that's exactly, to a great part, what motorsport athletes do and what motorsport teams do. Now, this isn't to say that the trainers who currently work with drivers are doing a bad job, but what they're doing is they're basing most of what they do on the anecdotal report coming from the driver. What my colleague and I were proposing, that we needed to use data-based recommendations. We needed data from the driver, from the car during competition on which to base his or her training regimens. Now, to be fair, I don't know that real world or real-time testing of athletes is all that unusual, especially with monitoring devices becoming as small as they are. In sport, monitoring provides a more full and a more comprehensive understanding of what the athlete experiences, and it provides the trainer an understanding of what it takes to perform at a given level and how to prepare his or her athlete. And really, driver science really just seeks to apply to motorsports what's been done for years in the more traditional sports. And so, like the traditional athlete, we can measure some of the same things in the driver athlete with the aid of microtechnology. For example, during the actual race, we can measure heart rate in real time. We can measure core body temperature in real time. We can look at physiological strain, which is a derived value that uses the heart rate response and the core temperature response. We have on occasion looked at blood glucose in real time. Like the traditional athlete, we can do pre and post lactate. We've looked at respiratory rate and a number of other things, including electrolyte changes and epinephrine surrogates like alpha amylase and salivary cortisol. So just like the traditional athlete, we can look at some of the same things in the driver athlete to get an idea of what he or she is experiencing while they're competing in the car. Some of the tech that I use is a combination of existing technology and new technology. For example, we use a sensor pill that the driver swallows to measure core body temperature. That pill, when swallowed, sends out a radio signal while it's in the driver's body, and we can pick up that signal with a receiver that we place in the car. Similarly, on occasion, we've measured blood sugar levels, and we've done that using a wireless device that many diabetics use to monitor their daily blood sugar levels. And on the more sort of cutting edge or leading edge side of things, I've also worked with a company called CoreSight. And what CoreSight's done is they've developed a dermal patch that the driver wears on their forearm, and that dermal patch measures electrolyte concentrations and electrolyte changes. And from that, we can work on replacement strategies once the driver comes out of the car. More specifically, what the dermal patch looks at are changes in sodium, potassium, and chloride. And I think that this is perhaps the first representation of where this kind of technology can go. The introduction of wireless microtechnology for the non-invasive monitoring of the driver. This kind of technology, I think, has great potential, and we'll talk about that as we go further in today's discussion. The methodology that I use is typically a case study approach for the most part, given that I've been trying to observe what I think is a very unique condition, and we've been working to quantify that very unique condition. I'll be honest and tell you up front that conducting research with professional race car drivers who have a myriad of responsibilities before they ever step foot in the car can be quite challenging. Nonetheless, we try. We gather baseline data in what is a relatively thermoneutral environment. We then try to minimize the driver's pre-race physical activity. And honestly, that's really hard. Between autograph sessions and sponsor responsibilities and running back and forth to the pit to see what the engineer is doing or what the other driver is doing, it is admittedly sometimes hard. But eventually the time comes for the driver to jump in the car and off they go. While the driver's in the car, we have the opportunity to gather real-time data on a minute-by-minute basis. Now, the time that the driver spends in the cockpit can vary from as little as about 45 minutes all the way through to over 2.5 hours, depending on the race and depending on how many drivers are driving in that particular event. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we've also collected blood glucose, we have collected heart rate, core body temperature. We've even, like I said, on occasion done pre and post driving cortisol, we've done alpha amylase, and we've done lactate. Once the driver's finished, we can also then calculate some of the derived values by looking at the data that we gathered during the course of the race event. The team that I've worked with most recently and most frequently is the Wayne Taylor Racing team. Wayne Taylor Racing competes in the International Motorsports Association prototype category, which is why the race car looks so much like a jet fighter or maybe even like a spaceship. One of the first times that we collected data with the team was at Watkins Glen in New York. The team was there to do some testing, and so we had a chance to monitor their drivers during these testing sessions. During the course of the day, the team tried various setups and various race configurations, ranging from just 10 minutes on the track to as long as 40 minutes on the track. And what was particularly interesting was that on a day where the outside temperature never really got to 70 degrees, the drivers were exhibiting core body temperatures ranging from 99 degrees Fahrenheit to as high as 102.7. Now remember, if you were to present with a temperature, a persistent temperature of 102.7 near to 103, you would most likely end up in urgent care being treated for a fever, and they would work very diligently to reduce that temperature. What we found was that this was something that the drivers were tolerating on a fairly regular basis. Likewise, their physiological strain variables ranged from moderate all the way through to the high range. And what this made really clear to us, and what we took away from this, was that even in relatively cool ambient environments, a race car driver is being subjected to some very challenging conditions. But more importantly, what came out of these testing sessions were, as is the case often with research, more questions. For example, what would happen to the driver when they drove 2 or 3 stints over the course of the race? What's important to remember is that it's not terribly uncommon, especially in sports car racing, for 2 or 3 drivers to share the car over the course of a 10 or a 12 or a 24-hour race. And so a driver may be in the car at the beginning of the race for 45 minutes, an hour, or an hour and a half, and then he may turn the car over to his teammate. And he may rest for 2 or 3 or 4 hours, depending what the engineer's strategy is. And then he may be back in the car in as little as 45 minutes or as long as, say, 2 or 3 hours. And so what would happen to the driver? What would their response be to, say, a double or a triple stint? What was the role, or what would be the role, of recovery in between these stints? What kind of feeding? What kind of hydration? What about sleep deprivation? While they try to get sleep during the course of an extended race event, drivers are very interested in what's happening to their teammates and in what's happening to the car. And so it's sometimes hard to get them to leave the pit stand or the pit area and to take a rest and to eat and to take care of themselves. So not only did we learn some really interesting information at Watkins Glen, but we also came away with some really interesting questions. The next time we collected data with the team was at the Petit Le Mans in Brazelton, Georgia. The Petit Le Mans is a 10-hour endurance race at the end of the sports car season, and it's run typically in late September, early October, depending on the schedule. It's run at the race course in Brazelton called Road Atlanta, and this is a 2.5-mile road course that has a variety of left and right turns and a variety of elevation changes. The unfortunate part of the Petit Le Mans was that there was a problem with the equipment and we didn't capture all 10 hours of data. Now, what I think is important to mention here is that that's the nature of research. For all of the preparation we go through, for all of the logistics that we try to put in order, sometimes things don't work out the way that we had hoped to, but you continue on the best way you can. And this is exactly what happened at Petit Le Mans. We had an equipment failure and we weren't able to capture all 10 hours of racing, but we did capture a single driving session for 2 of the 3 drivers. And what we found was that, yes, drivers are challenged to a very significant degree while they're in the cockpit. In fact, driver 1 went into the car with a core body temperature of about 99 degrees Fahrenheit and came out of the car with a temperature of near to 102 degrees Fahrenheit. Similarly, driver 2 went into the car with a core body temperature of about 99.5 degrees, and he came out of the car with a temperature of just over 101 degrees. What's more interesting, though, was that while driver 1 went into the car with a low PSI value, driver 2 went into the car with a slightly elevated PSI value of 2.16. And so while the event wasn't entirely successful from a data collection perspective, we did come away with data that confirmed the strain that the driver endures, and we came away with, again, more questions. For example, what is the impact of pre-driving behavior? Did driver 2 go into the car with a slight disadvantage given that his PSI was already elevated? And also, what is the impact of age? Like I said, there were 3 drivers. We only got to collect data on 2 of them, but the third was a gentleman of 53 years of age. And so it would have been interesting, I think, to look at that comparison between drivers 1 and 2, who were in their early to mid 20s, and driver 3, who was in his early 50s. And so again, as is the case with science, we came away with more questions. Our most ambitious effort so far has been a project that was completed in collaboration with Dr. David Ferguson at Michigan State University's Spartan Motorsports Performance Lab. The goal of the project was to monitor 3 drivers for the entirety of the 24 hours of Daytona. In the end, we were able to get 16 hours and 43 minutes of data before the team retired the car due to repeated on-track damage. With over 16 hours of data on 3 different drivers on a variety of physiological variables, what I'll tell you at this point in the process is that the data analysis is ongoing. We've also had an opportunity to collect data on female drivers. Back in 2016, I and my students spent a week at a private racetrack in Arizona. During that time, we had a small group of female drivers complete 45-minute semi-competitive driving sessions, during which time we measured their heart rate, we measured their core body temperature, and we measured their physiological strain. Now, for the sake of clarification, what we mean by semi-competitive is if you put more than 2 race car drivers on a racetrack, they're going to try and beat one another. So what we told them was that there was a small trophy for the person who drove the fastest, drove the hardest, and won the session. And we triggered that sort of competitive response so that they just weren't out there turning laps. We wanted them to be up on the wheel. We wanted them to drive hard. We wanted them to replicate as near as they could what they would experience when they were actually in a race car competing against other drivers. And so we had them compete these 45-minute semi-competitive driving sessions, during which time we collected all of this all of this data. What we found in some of this early testing was that women have a similar physiological response as their male counterparts. On average, the pre and post driving core temperature ranged from 98.7 at the beginning of driving through to about 101 at the end of driving, and that was very similar to their male counterparts. The average pre and post driving PSI again, was about 2.3 at the beginning of the driving session and ranged into the moderate range of about 5.0 when they finished driving. While this was interesting, what we also noticed was that although similar in their overall responses, the female drivers did seem to get hotter faster than their male counterparts. And when you combine this with the known physiological differences, female driver athletes may be at a disadvantage for managing uncompensable heat stress. But what's really interesting is that Dr. Ferguson and his group at Michigan State have actually addressed this very topic in a soon-to-be published manuscript. In fact, if my memory serves me, it may already be available online, and you might want to check that out because it'll make for a very good read. Now, while all of this has been really good and has helped to make the case that the driver athlete is being significantly challenged, the problem is that all of the data, while captured in real time, is stored within each device. And we only see the changes in the driver once the data is downloaded after the driver has finished. And so the hope for the future is to be able to have an actual real-time data stream coming from the car to the pit stand with the goal of being able to make real-time decisions during the actual race event. On top of all of that, the race car is a particularly unfriendly environment to electronics. And so when you have wireless devices, there's a great deal of electrical interference that you have to deal with. And so when you run these stints and you collect this data, it's not uncommon for there to be dropouts. There are data points that are missing. There are measures of time that go unmeasured because of the environment of the race car. And so what we're hoping is that in the future, we can actually incorporate this into the actual electronics of the car so that that data stream is uninterrupted and we get a really good picture about what the driver athlete has experienced and that we continue to learn about the driver athlete. And so moving forward, what I think needs to happen is that we need to take advantage of new non-invasive microtechnology. And to be clear, I'm not talking about retail biometrics that are all the rage right now. It wasn't long ago, in fact, I think it was perhaps a year or two ago, that NASCAR approved drivers being allowed to wear things like Garmin and Fitbits in the car to track themselves. Now, I'm not taking a shot at Garmin or Fitbit. I think they have fantastic devices in the application that they were meant to be used for. If we're going to measure a driver in such a challenging environment and in such an aggressive environment, we need robust, valid, reliable, scientific grade equipment so that we can actually assess the driver's physiological response. So in summary, let me say this. Driver athletes are subjected to significant physiological stress. We have determined that, I have determined that, and my colleagues who do research in the area of driver science have determined that. More importantly, I think that there is great potential for real-time monitoring and decision-making in motorsports. Secondly, I think that wearable, non-invasive technology is really the future of athletic monitoring. I think that it has great potential outside of racing. And if you think about sports like soccer and football, wouldn't it be nice to know when a soccer athlete has suffered an impact sufficient to cause a concussion? Wouldn't it be nice to know the actual body temperature of a football player during a hot summer practice or a hot summer game? And to be clear, there are some fantastic devices that are coming out, and this kind of research is really beginning to gain traction. What we need to focus on, though, is non-invasive tech that really doesn't interfere with the athlete's play or the way that they feel. What we have found in working with our race car drivers is that anything that disrupts the way they drive, the way they feel while they're driving, or anything that is outside of the norm, they are not terribly responsive to. And so as we move forward, we have to find a way to develop technology that I think is going to be the most non-invasive and that allows the athlete to play exactly how he or she wants to play. I also think that this kind of research is a stepping off point for research that addresses not so traditional sports and their athletes. Think about the athletes that you see competing in extreme sports. Think about the athletes that you see competing in the X Games. Think about all the new sports that athletes are competing in and how little we know about them. I am amazed by the athletes that I see competing in these kinds of sports, and I look at them the same way that I look at driver athletes, and I wonder just exactly how can they do that, and what does it take to do that? And as an example of that, I'll share some work with you that we had an opportunity to complete while we were in Arizona. As I said, while we were in Arizona testing our female driver athletes, we also had an opportunity to work with a small group of professional MotoGP riders. Now, people say that race car drivers are a unique breed of people. I'm here to tell you, and I can testify to the fact that MotoGP riders are just a strange group of individuals. The two images on the screen are screen captures from our GoPro camera that we had mounted on the bikes while the drivers were riding. And similar to our female athletes, we told the riders to go out and compete against one another, and that they would actually win a small trophy if they won the session. And so when you put more than two MotoGP riders out on a racetrack, they're going to compete against one another. And what you see in the top left corner of your screen is an example of just what these guys and girls are like. This is a gentleman who is in a left-hand turn. He is traveling in excess of 160 miles an hour, and it's a banked left-hand turn. And if you've ever seen the MotoGP rider, they lean very hard into the turn. Well, this particular gentleman saw that he was really close to the ground, and that if he leaned over just a little further, he could actually scrape his helmet on the ground while doing over 160 plus miles an hour. And so this gives you an idea of the kind of people that we are dealing with. These guys are really on the edge athletes. And when you watch them, you see that it takes a lot of effort to manage the bike and to control the bike and to stay on the line as they're racing against one another and as they're racing in competition. And so, like the female athletes, I thought it would be really interesting to take the equipment we had used and wire up our rider athletes. And so as you see in the bottom right image, you can see a belt around the driver's waist. That is some of the equipment that we put on the driver to monitor everything that he was doing, at least from a physiological perspective, while he was competing against his colleagues on the track. And so I just thought it would be interesting to take some of that same equipment and put it on the riders. And it's not going to be long before the manuscript is finished, and let's say that it's in preparation now, and I expect that it's going to be submitted for publication in the not too distant future. So in closing, what I'd like to say again is thank you for your interest in motorsports and in driver science. It's always a joy and a pleasure for me when I get to share my work with interested people. And if you have questions after today's webinar or would like to see examples of my work, please feel free to contact me. My email is listed there, or check out my website. There are examples of some of the work we've done there as well. With it being the month of May, and with May being so focused on racing, I hope that you found today's webinar interesting and hopefully enjoyable. And just let me say thank you, and I appreciate your time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have today.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Potkanowicz. I think I got it right that time.
You did.
That's a hard one. We are going to take a few questions now. That was super fascinating, and everyone here in the national office could hear the passion in your voice as you gave that presentation. So that was really exciting for us to hear as well. So we're going to start with a question. Given what you described related to what the drivers wear, what can or do they do in the cockpit to try to dissipate heat given the environment that they're in and the clothes that they're wearing?
It depends on the series. If we talk about IndyCar racing with the Indy 500 coming up, there isn't much that they do. There is no ventilation, there is no air conditioning. Once the driver slides into the cockpit and once they're strapped in, the only air is the air that's passing over the cockpit as they're driving at speed. A number of years back, there was a particularly hot race in Houston. They actually did a doubleheader in Houston, and the drivers were complaining about how hot it got and how much trouble they were having recovering after practice and after race 1 and race 2. And so IndyCar allowed them to open up a small vent in the nose of the car. Well, drivers and teams are very competitive, and what they immediately realized was that if you open a vent in the nose of the car, that changes the aerodynamic characteristics of the car and potentially slows the car down. And so many of the teams didn't take advantage of that opportunity because they felt it would compromise their competitiveness. So in IndyCar, there really isn't much that they can do. Once they're in, they're in. Now, if you take something like sports car racing, the sanctioning body for sports car, which is the International Motorsports Association, or what is known as IMSA, they do have requirements that the car must be air conditioned and it must be within 10 degrees of ambient temperature. Well, if you look at some of the times of year when the races are being run, ambient temperature can be 80, 90 degrees. So that means that while the in-car temperature is reduced, it still can be 75, 80, 85 degrees in the car. And so there's that, but I don't know that necessarily it's gone far enough. And then when you talk about NASCAR, I'm sure you've noticed, and we even saw in the image in the presentation, there's often a hose that goes into the back of the helmet. That hose is connected to a vent that allows air to come into the car and to cool the driver's head. But again, this is just head cooling. It isn't so much whole body cooling. Now, there are series and instances where drivers will wear what's called a cool shirt or a cooling vest, and this circulates cool water through the vest to help dissipate some of that heat. But A, some drivers don't like to use it. B, they are known to fail on occasion and they don't work as well as they should. And C, drivers will complain that it gets kind of sweaty, even more sweaty, and traps more liquid underneath the shirt than it does underneath, say, the driving suit itself. So it depends on the series, what a driver has available to him or her to manage that body temperature. But in many times, even with the best intentions, the drivers still are subjected to some really strong thermal stresses.
Great, thank you so much. We are learning a lot today. This is going to make watching the Indy 500 really fun.
Well, that's what I hope. That's what I hope actually, is that when people look at the race, after having heard Dr. Ferguson talk and myself talk, that you look at the race with a completely different set of eyes and see just exactly how athletic this is as a sport.
So this data that you're collecting in real time, do you anticipate that that would help in sort of real-time decision-making during a race, or that it would be more used to help train and prepare or for recovery of a driver?
I think all three. Because once you've learned what I like to call the thermal signature of a driver, how he or she responds to a particular race, or how collected over a year, over the course of a season, what is their thermal signature? How does their body temperature go up? How high does it go up? Does it plateau? When you learn about the driver, then you can actually make real-time decisions. You can use that data for training, and you can look at that data, determine how stressed or how challenged the driver was, and then devise a recovery strategy that is most applicable. For example, if you use something as simple as physiological strain, if you had a live stream coming to the engineer's pit box, to his screen, you could see that, well, your driver is getting to the point where we know that they're going to start to fall off in performance. Well, wouldn't it be to the team's advantage if I could take my driver out before that point? Now, in fairness, it's going to be one heck of a thing to get a driver to come out of the seat, to call him or her in if they feel like they're really up on the wheel. But just like we use information about the car to make changes to the car to keep the car competitive, we can use data about the driver to make changes in the driver so the team stays competitive. So you can use the data, I think, in real time to make decisions in the race, especially in sports car racing and endurance racing. Maybe not so much in IndyCar racing because it's a singular event that lasts about 2 or 3 hours, but even then, you could be in the driver's ear and be telling them you need to drink, because drivers do carry a drink bottle in the car with them in the 500. It's a 100 milliliter bottle that they carry with them, and you could be in the driver's ear reminding them to drink in an effort, admittedly a small effort, to stay hydrated. So you can use the data in the car, I think, depending on the series, but certainly you can use it for training, because then you can train to what you know about the driver and how he or she responds, and then you can use it for recovery to determine just how big of a stress they've endured and then how to recover from that stress. So I think it has applicability across each one of those conditions.
Great. That leads nicely to another question we had about this real-time data. You had mentioned earlier that some of that data comes across the dash for the driver. It sounds like perhaps this isn't something that, not all of these things anyway, would be something that a driver would be trying to monitor in real time, but that perhaps there would be a team member or some sort of exercise specialist perhaps that would be looking at this data as it came through and then coaching the driver on what changes need to happen.
I think that's exactly the case. And I think, as Dr. Ferguson probably mentioned in his talk, Charlie Kimball sees his blood sugar data coming across his dashboard, and he also has an individual in the pit who is monitoring him at all times. I think that we can change the mindset of the driver community to be more responsive. They are desperately interested in their fitness out of the car, and they understand the importance of training out of the car. Once you put them in the car, their competitive juices turn on and they are on the wheel and they are driving. What we have to do is we have to teach them that what they do outside of the car obviously has applicability in the car, but then how to use it in the car so that they're monitoring it as well. And yes, I think it would be applicable, and I would love to see it where teams actually had a physiologist in the pit who is monitoring the driver, reporting to the engineer, just as the chassis engineer is reporting to the engineer, just as the suspension engineer is reporting to the engineer, just as all of the information about the car is coming to the engineer, we should have information about the driver coming to the engineer. It's what I like to call the driver car system. You take a device, a machine that we have myriads of sensors on, and then we put it into the hands of a fallible human that we really don't know anything about during the course of the race. I would love to see the driver wired the same way as the car so that we can get that same kind of information and make those decisions, and have someone on the pit whose job is solely to look at the driver, look at his or her response, and report that back to the engineer. So yes, I think that's a fantastic idea, and I think that's where we need to go when we talk about driver science.
For listening. So we know, I think it's true that in motorsports there are younger, like teen and preteen drivers that are obviously learning the ropes and coming up. Do we have any data on the younger folks who might be a little bit more amenable to technology?
You know, that's a great question. And when you talk about youth drivers, that's really an entirely different subset of individuals. There are so many different concerns when it comes to thermoregulatory responses, physiological responses to the environment of the driving, the environment of the cockpit. To my knowledge, we've not looked at a ton of youth racers, but I'll be honest and tell you that most of my work has been with the adult professional racer, with younger drivers, with drivers coming up at a much younger age and people becoming interested at a much younger age. I think that opens up a whole new area. Much like I think we need to focus more on the female athlete, I think we need to focus on the older athlete. One of the characteristics of sports car racing is that you find older race car drivers in sports car racing. It's not uncommon to find people who are in their late 40s, early 50s driving in sports car racing. So when you look at the demographics of the driver population, you find that there are so many more people than just young male drivers competing. There are young athletes, there are female athletes, there are older athletes. And I think younger athletes represent just one area of where driver science can go, and I hope will go in the future. But to my knowledge, we've not done a terrible amount of work with the younger driver, but I think it has great potential.
Great. So another question that came in was, do you generally see any sort of performance decrement with these increases in core temperature? Or how might you assess that even?
Well, that is exactly the problem. We collect the data in real time, and it's only after they come out of the car that we can really sort of identify what they've gone through. If they recover adequately, if they feed adequately, if they hydrate adequately between stints, then we have gotten them near to their baseline state going into the car the next time. But as of yet, we don't see that decrement or that performance deficit really in real time. The way that you would track that perhaps is, looking at lap time, or whether or not they're hitting their mark, or whether or not they're staying on the line, or where they are in position on the racetrack. But what we're seeing is only data after it's finished. And that's to my earlier point. We would love to be able for this to be a live stream so that I can actually tell you, yes, there's a performance deficit that is happening or is about to happen based on what I know about the driver. So right now, the performance deficits are not so obvious, but we're working on it. And as a side note, drivers won't often tell you if they're not up to par. They want to be in the seat as much as they can, and you have to earn their trust to get them to report to you accurately what they're feeling. So it's sometimes a challenge to get them to tell you what they're feeling and to see if that matches up with the data that you're seeing.
Yeah, that's a really great point. We can see how that would be a challenge. We're going to take 2 more questions. What would you most like to measure that you currently aren't able to, but you are hopeful that technology will soon be able to assist you with?
Wow, that is a great question, and that would be a question. That would be an answer longer than my Christmas list. My goodness, like I said from the very beginning, I would love to have an uninterrupted data stream of core temperature, heart rate, from which we can derive a real-time and active physiological strain value. But I also think that we have the potential with microtechnology to be measuring things like carbon monoxide levels. We have the potential to be measuring, oh goodness. Well, if I had my druthers and if I was a mad scientist, I would love to put an indwelling line in, but I can't do that. I would say that measures that are immediately related to known performance deficits. So as core temperature goes up, I know cognition is challenged. As core temperature goes up, I know that muscular effort and muscular potential starts to fade. I think really my answer would be uninterrupted data streams. One of the biggest challenges that I've had so far in some of my data collection is the environment of the cockpit being so challenging for electrical equipment. I would just love to see an uninterrupted stream so that I could create a true and accurate sort of thermal signature or physiological signature for the drivers of interest. From there, boy, that's a great question. And I think I don't know that we could do blood sugar, we could do carbon monoxide. Boy, that's a great question. That's like opening Pandora's box.
All right, so there's the challenge to any of our biomedical engineers listening today. All right, final question. Here in the Indianapolis office, we are very curious to know, based on your scientific expertise and opinion, who's going to win this year's Indy 500?
You know what? I'm going to have to give you a very bad answer, and let me say it this way. I am a fan of motorsports. I don't necessarily follow one driver. The joke that I like to tell my students is that if there were 2 cockroaches on the ground, I would stop to see who wins the race. So I am just a fan of motorsports. But in the interest of being a good guest and answering your question, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it's going to be one of the rookies like Colton Herta or Rosenquist. They've been strong this year. The rookie class has been particularly strong this year coming into the 500. And while I'm a while I've watched Tony Kanaan over the course of his career, and I've watched Scott Dixon win, and I was happy to see Will Power win last year, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that this is going to be the year for a rookie to win the 500, because it seems to be a theme. Alexander Rossi won it just a couple years ago as a rookie. So this particular rookie class, I think, is particularly strong, and I'm going to go forced choice. I'm going to say Colton Herta.
Folks, you heard it here first. All right, thank you so much, Ed. That was a great presentation. We had a lot of great questions come in. Thank you to all who joined us today. Students, thank you especially for taking time out of what is a very, very busy time of year. You're probably through with finals. Some of you maybe have gotten through graduation. Others of you are just hoping to graduate, probably. I remember being in that boat. So anyway, thank you for your time today. We always take a break during the summer, so our next brown bag will be in the fall, come September. So we want to wish everyone a great summer. Thank you again for joining us, and we're going to end the webinar now with a round of applause for Dr. Potkanowicz from the national office. Thank you.